Hi everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, evening, whatever time zone you're joining us from. Super excited to have you all at today's community webinar. And today it's going to be on defining open source AI. And we have a very important guest with us today. So feel free to let me know where you're joining us from. I'm joining right now from Nigeria. I can see Ariel. Hi. Hi, Toby Lover. So yeah, feel free to let me know where you're joining from. Hi everyone. Today we have Mer with us, and I'll get to introduce Mer shortly. And this is pretty much just our short agenda. We'll have the welcome session from now to like 5:05. This is in Watts time zone, by the way. And then we have the talk section from 5:05 to 5:35. And then we have a Q&A session just at the end. We did receive a couple of questions before now, so we'll prioritize those. But if you do have any questions, just right from the talk is going on, you can put that in the chat. And I believe also some questions will be asked to you today. Feel free to use the chat as much as you want. So I'm just going to give a few seconds to see where we have folks joining from. Hi, Tobilova. How's it going? All right. Okay, so today we're going to have Mer with us. Mer is the founder and principal of Do Big Good. She provides primary project leadership, carries out analysis of stakeholder input, and writes reports for clients. She has worked for over a decade at the intersection of research, policy, innovation, and social change. Mer was new media operations manager on President Obama's 2008 campaign, co-wrote and led the creation of the 2010 book Digital Activism Decoded, and designed and managed a first of its kind digital activism dataset as a graduate research fellow of the National Science Foundation. Mer has collaborated with nonprofits, foundations, think tanks, and firms in North America, Eastern Europe, Latin America, and the Middle East, including the Open Government Partnership, Microsoft, and Google VR. She undertook graduate studies in public policy and communication at the Harvard Kennedy School of Government and the University of Washington, and undergraduate studies in history and Africana studies at Varsha College and the University of Ghana, which is really interesting. We're going to talk more about that at the end and how Mer found herself in Ghana. Having lived in Ghana, Morocco, Chile, and India, Mer now lives in Seattle, where she enjoys biking, superhero movies, and intentional communities. Please welcome Mer.
Yeah, great to be here. Thank you
Hi.
so good to be here. Thank you so much.
Nice to have you.
Yeah.
This is quite a very interesting biography, quite long, by the way. So we're going to get into that mostly at the end. So I'm sure people also will be curious. It's a very interesting trajectory of your career. We're so glad to have you with us today, and we're looking forward to learning more about the open source AI definition.
Yeah, thank you so much. I've actually lived in Africa for 3 years of my life. So 2.5 years in Morocco, and then I guess it was a semester in Ghana where I also traveled a lot around West Africa. So so it's so great to be talking to this group. Yeah, it's a pleasure.
Very interesting. All right, so you want to get started?
Would you like me to start?
Yes.
Okay. All right. So thank you everyone for coming. So today I'm going to talk about the open source AI definition, which is a project that I'm working on for the Open Source Initiative. Next slide. Okay. Yep. And the Open Source Initiative is globally recognized as the authority that defines open source. So they steward the open source definition for software currently. They are a nonprofit with global scope, formed to educate and advocate for the benefits of open source and to build bridges among different constituencies in the open source community. Next slide. So I know that you all know about open source software. Obviously, you have the open source community. And for the purposes of this presentation, I'm just going to summarize open source as source code that anyone may study, use, modify, and share. Next. And we're going to be combining that concept with this other concept of artificial intelligence. Oh, okay. I was going to stop. I was going to ask people to give their own definitions of OSA of AI, but now they've seen my definition. So there's many ways of defining artificial intelligence. Obviously, it refers to a concept, not a specific technology or methodology. So even though now we have LLMs, is machine learning is basically the central methodology for artificial intelligence. That is but one way of implementing this concept. Do I want to control my own slides? I would say maybe not, because I have not used this platform before. But I will just say next slide when I want a new slide. Yes. So for now, this is, I think, a definition that's very simple and straightforward and accurate. So artificial intelligence is just a computational mimic of human cognition, right? That can be implemented technologically in a number of ways. Next slide. So if we combine these two concepts of open source and artificial intelligence, we could call it OSAI. And then next slide. We can just say that OSAI is a computational mimic of human cognition that anyone may study, use, modify, and share. So is that the definition of open source AI? Not quite, because the big question is how. How do we implement all those different concepts? So next slide. So yes, I'm working on this project called the Open Source AI Definition, which is a project of OSI, which I introduced you to previously. And we use the acronym OSAID or OSAID to describe the definition. And this work is funded by the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation, and I will be describing it in the coming slides. Next slide, please. Yeah, so first of all, why? Why would we be putting all this effort into defining open source AI? I would say the first reason, which isn't on this slide, is just that there is no official definition of open source AI now. So there is this issue of open washing, which is that any AI developer, company producing an AI system could say, oh, ours is open. And there's no reference point to say it's not. And so you have this dilution of what open source means. You have people saying something is open when it's really not. And that's really not to the benefit of anyone except for those firms that are using that language for marketing purposes, which is, that's a pretty narrow benefit. So we want to define open source so it can, have legs and be strong and benefit everyone the way open source does. And the specific benefits of open source, and this is a slide from the Digital Public Goods Alliance created by Leah Gimple. And it's just a really nice summary of the benefits. So we have transparency, accountability, and safety. That OSAI allows for auditing. That's the study freedom, auditing of systems which communicate bias and ensure accountability and transparency. Also have data sources, which we'll talk about. And accelerates AI safety research because the code is visible, the data is transparent. And the model is also transparent, right? As much as a machine learning model can be. And then we have also these economic effects, market deconcentration, innovation, quality, and AI polyculture, which is, I love all these words that she's used. So it makes models available to a broader range of actors, both researchers and economic actors. And it tackles the AI monoculture by providing more stakeholders access to the foundational technology. Very intuitive. And then finally, she writes, foundation for context-specific application. So that means that there can be many more projects created that have a local function. So for example, at a workshop that Leigh and I did last week, we learned about a project called Digital Green, which is in India, and they have a text bot for farmers. And so farmers can say, oh, my crop has these, seems to be like, I seem to have some insects or some pests attacking my crop. What could this be? And then the chat bot will respond to them via text. And this might not be an application that would be of interest to, a firm based in the US, but with OSAI, not yet. But with OSAI, you can have those local applications with representation of cultural and linguistic diversity. For example, that model is the farmers would be able to text in a local language, and then there's a translation layer, and then there's the search layer. Next slide. Okay, so now I'm going to talk about our definition and where it is at the moment. Go next slide. So the OSCA is currently on version 0.0.8, and if you scan that QR code, you will see the version of the definition that allows for commenting. So you can share your comments on the definition. And I'll go through the parts now. Next slide. Okay, so just to summarize the parts, and then I'll make it obviously larger so you can read it. Oh, great. There's a link. Perfect. We have a preamble. Next slide. We describe the 4 freedoms as they apply to open source AI. Next slide. We have the preferred form for modification. Next slide. And then currently we have a legal checklist, which talks about how the preferred form might be interpreted for specific AI components. And this will be separated in the next version of the definition. We're going to deal with licensing of components in a separate work stream. Next slide. So first of all, the preamble, it's saying very similar things to the slide that I just presented from DPGA, basically talking about removing barriers to learning, use sharing, and improvement, reinforcing that the mechanism for openness will be the license regime that the open source initiative used for software to implement the open source definition. And then finally, highlighting the ability to build and deploy and reinforcing these values of reliability and transparency. Next. So the 4 freedoms, and these are derived from the 4 freedoms of the free software definition. So they are use the system for any purpose with or without having to ask permission. Wait, sorry, let me read that correctly. Use the system for any purpose and without having to ask permission, very important. Study how the system works and inspect its components, modify the system for any purpose, including to change its output, and share the system with others, for others to use with or without modification for any purpose. So that should not be a surprise to anyone. It's very similar to the 4 freedoms for software. We've just applied it to AI. And we created these through a co-design process that I'll talk about later. Next. So this is the meat of the definition, this section on the preferred form of making modifications. And again, this is specific to the machine learning method of creating an AI, and also generative AI specifically. So this has been the most controversial element of the definition, this section on data. So in the current version, we call this section data information. And the requirement is that there's sufficiently detailed information about the data used to train the system so that a skilled person can recreate a substantially equivalent system using the same or similar data. So the big point of controversy has been this fact that in this language, there is the option of same data, which means the original training data is shared, or similar data, which means the original training data is not shared. And some people, many people in fact, would like the same data, the actual training data used to create the foundation model, to also be shared. But this definition creates more flexibility. It allows for the same data, it allows for synthetic data, it allows for similar data, and then it has all these requirements around transparency, around training methods. So this smaller text beneath, it says, for example, this data information should include the training methodologies and techniques, description of what data set was used, even if the data set itself is not shared, information on provenance of data sets, scope and characteristics, how it was obtained and selected, labeling procedures. So really data cleaning methodologies. So really rigorous requirements about describing the data, even if the data set itself is not shared. Secondly, the source code used to train and run the system must be shared. And there's some descriptions of what that code would be. And finally, the model parameters must also be shared. So that is the current definition of open source AI. Next. So there's also additional board guidance. So this is the board of OSI. And this was approved at the end of June and further guides the development of the OSAID after version 0.0.8. Next slide. And the key elements of this guidance are that the definition must be supported by diverse stakeholders, particularly end users, developers, deployers, and subjects, which I'll talk about later, that it provides real-world examples. So that means it cannot be an empty set. It cannot be a definition that for which no current system meets the criteria. And the purpose for that is that it have a practical use in the present, not just in some possible future state. Okay. And the final piece is that we complete this process by October of this year. There has been a need for this definition the entire time we've been working on it. And there's been this, I think, reasonable pressure and desire. Okay, is it finished yet? Is it finished yet? Is it finished yet? So we have this requirement of October to actually have it finished. Next. Okay, so I see. Oh, you can go next one. I think the slide wasn't something I was, okay. From a previous, oh, and you can just go to the next one too. I guess this one is showing the skip slides. Glad there's nothing really horrendously inaccurate in that. Okay, so now we're going to talk about the co-design process. So how did we get here? Next slide. So a global definition requires global consultation. And this means that equitable and inclusive stakeholder representation is not only about justice, but it's about legitimacy, right? If you're gonna create a standard that applies to the world, you have to consult with and represent the world. That's at least my opinion. And I think in this age of virtual meetings and asynchronous communication, there's really no reason not to have global representation for global policy. Next slide. Yeah, so in order to do that work, that global consultation, OSI used this method called co-design. So co-design is a set of creative methods for making public decisions with, not for, directly impacted stakeholders by sharing knowledge and power, right? Because people who are directly impacted, they have unique knowledge about how the decision will impact them. And there is a need for a transfer of power from those who conventionally make decisions to those who have been excluded from making decisions in order for those impacted to actually say, hey, this is what's actually going to work. This is what's not going to work. So co-design is a method of making that better, more representative form of a public decision. Next. Oh, back. And so next, stop. So this is what my firm does, Do Big Good. So I'm the founder of this firm. It's a company. You could call it a social enterprise because it is a social enterprise. So it is a co-design firm, and we're based in Seattle in the US. And we use participatory design methods and social justice principles to help clients decide, thank you, with stakeholders around the world to achieve transformative change. And so OSI is our client. Go next. So the first co-design question we had for the OSAID was, we have these 4 principles, use, study, modify, share, and what should these open source principles mean for artificial intelligence? Next. So we started with in-person workshops, and you can see on that drawing on the right, that people were actually writing what each part of the definition should be. So for this one, it's for use, and it says use the system for any purpose without any limitations and without having to ask for permission. So you can see that the spirit is basically very similar to the final definition. It's just the words are a little bit different, right? And you had people working in small groups, and everyone was writing on butcher paper. And this was at the All Things Open conference in Raleigh in the United States. Next. We had another workshop of this type in Monterey, which is the state of California, that same month. That was a Linux Foundation Member Summit. And you can also see here's some examples for study. This group wrote, study how the AI system works and inspect its components. Access to the AI system components in the preferred form to modify is a precondition of this. So you can see how, again, there was a bit more content in the study definition, but then this idea of a preferred form, it kind of became its own section. And then share, it says share the system with or without any modification for any purpose, which I think is actually the language that we used, or almost identical to what we actually used. And then it has this bracket without limitation, and I think we did not use that. So you can see how different people were describing what they wanted to see, and then we were synthesizing these different wordings together. Next. And the last workshop of this type was in Addis in Ethiopia, and that was in November. And it's a little blurry, but basically on the lower left-hand corner, you can see it says study as a printout. So basically what happened, because each workshop we were iterating and kind of building on the definition and then passing that version onto the next workshop group. So in this one, we had a version based on the previous 2 workshops. And so people were giving comments on those Post-its on this version that we had from the previous 2 groups. Next. And so then the result of that was the 4 freedoms that I read to you in the beginning. Next. So our second co-design question after we had the 4 freedoms was, what components must be open in order for our AI system to be used, studied, modified, and shared? Next. And then again, we started with these in-person workshops, and we had one in San Jose, which is in California. And this is Ruth Seeley, who works at SAS and is also works for the Apache Software Foundation, and she was my co-facilitator. And you can see, for example, what the prompt was for the group work. For your group's AI system, how should the 4 freedoms apply to the components, code, model, and data for the systems to be licensed as open, right? And then again, you see people writing, for code, model, data, study, use, modify, share. There's a little box, and people can kind of make notes about how they think each freedom should apply to each type of component. But we got some feedback, which was, this is kind of an exclusionary way to be doing this process, because even though it's co-design, great, who has access to that room, right? Who can afford to travel to the US, to specifically the West Coast, well, the West and East Coast, but to the US to be in these rooms to co-design? And so I thought that's a really good point. So next. So we did shift then to a virtual co-design method, which we began in 2024, this year, to make the process more accessible. And working virtually helped us massively to improve both global representation and participant transparency. Because when we were doing the in-person sessions, everyone was able to be anonymous. So they were marking up the pages, but they didn't need to share their name or their affiliation. Whereas when we started the virtual process, part of the requirement of being a volunteer was that you had to be willing to say your name and your organizational affiliation. Next. So the way we structured this virtual work was we developed first 4 work groups that represented a diverse approach to AI openness. And so these are all, sorry, let me say that again. So these are all open source. These are systems self-described as open. So we're kind of starting with the default, how our systems self-describing as open, and then getting some perspective on that from volunteers. So we have Llama 2, which is a meta project, a commercial project, Bloom, which is an open science project, Pythia, another open science project with a permissive license, more so than Bloom, OpenCV, which is open source project, but also not a generative AI project. So, within this small cluster, a diverse range of how firms and other actors are seeing openness. Next slide. And in these work groups, you can see who is actually participating. And members all agreed to have their names shared publicly. And because we're working virtually at this point, 50% of participants are people of color, 30% are Black, and 25% are women, trans, and non-binary. So we were immediately able to have a much more inclusive and representative group of co-designers. Next. How am I doing on time? I see I'm about a half hour. How much time do I have left? $10 minutes for my own presentation? Great. Okay, that should be fine. Okay, so, and this is an example of how we created this more diverse group. So when we asked for volunteers, we would specifically say, for example, Black, Indigenous, Latina, and other people of color, women, queer, transgender, people with disabilities, people who are working class and poor are encouraged to respond. And we also did specific invitational outreach to groups that had been represented to take a little bit of the, I would say, uncertainty about who would respond, to make sure that the people who are missing from the room were in the room. Next. And then what these groups did, these 4 work groups, is that they voted for which component should be required for a system to be called open source. And so the work groups voted, then I compiled their votes, and that document is public. And it's also through people were sharing their initials. And so you can see exactly who voted for what component to be open. And then I posted the results of that voting on our forum, which I'll share a QR code to that shortly, to get just completely public feedback. So feedback from anyone, even if they're not in a work group. And then the executive director, Stefano, he edited the definition and posted the updated definition. And that also, like version 0.0.8, is a commentable version. So there was just as much transparency and public engagement as we could have at each stage. That was the goal. Next. So we have a third co-design question, which is which systems meet the criteria of the OSCA of the definition. Next. And so we have some more volunteers. Our goal was to review about 10 AI systems self-described as open to validate the definition, to see if it meets that requirement of the board, which is this cannot be an empty set. There must be some AI systems that actually meet the definition. And so you can see the different systems that we reviewed in that way. Next. And this is basically what the review looked like. This is also public. People started with the different components, and those components are drawn from something called the Model Openness Framework, created by the Linux Foundation. Then we said, what must the legal framework be? Thank you. And then where's the legal document for that component? And then does that legal document allow this component to be studied, used, modified, and shared? Next. So we found, this is a progress report on the validation process. So we found that working with system creators was really a requirement of being able to complete a validation, because it was hard for volunteers to find all the documents needed. Sometimes they'd be on GitHub, sometimes they'd be on Hugging Face, sometimes it would be a series of blog posts on Medium. Like, documentation of AI systems is kind of all over the place. But based on the information we were able to find, this is our expectation of the validation for these different systems, or how well they conform to the OSCA. So you can see Arctic expected yes, Bloom expected no, or confirmed no because of its license. It's has use restrictions. Llama 2 confirmed no. So for example, Llama 2, we had representatives from that system that were in the work group, and yet still, when the reviewers reviewed, they still said that was not going to meet the requirements. And then some of them we just were not able to get enough information, like Phi2 and Poro and OpenCV. Pythia's confirmed yes. And those system creators were very involved in the process and basically giving us the information we needed to do the review. Next. So yes, so in addition to thinking about global representation, we're also thinking about stakeholders with regard to the way they interact with OSAI, open source AI. And there are these 4 different identities that are particularly of interest to the board: the developer, who makes the AI system; the deployer, who seeks to study, use, modify, or share the system; the end user, who consumes an output, but is not actually trying to alter the system. So someone who's using a chatbot, that's like an end user. And then you have a subject, who's someone who's actually not choosing to use an AI system, but is still impacted by it. So a photographer who finds their image in a data set, even though they didn't give permission, or someone who's applying for a mortgage from a bank, and their bank is using some AI system to evaluate their application, and they didn't choose to have the AI do it, but it's just that's a choice being made by the company that they're seeking to interact with. So next. So among volunteers, about 31% are system creators. So they're people actually making these AI systems. About 46 were deployers, so people who actually want to study, use, or modify, or share the system, like an AI engineer or a researcher. I would say about 90% are end users. We assume that the volunteers have at least tried to use an AI product, and maybe some have not. And then we estimate that about 100% have been affected by AI in some way, simply because these systems are now so pervasive. Next. So the final slide here. Thank you to all our volunteers. These are all the volunteers in our project. We have 36 volunteers that represented 23 countries in terms of birth and residence. And African volunteers are highlighted. 1 in 4 volunteers are from Africa, which I'm really, really proud of. And almost half of that group are women. And also you can see they're coming from, Africa is a huge continent, so there are many countries that are not represented, but there are many that are. And I'm also very proud that it's a real range of different kind of identities. You have people working in civil society, people working in big international organizations, people working in universities. You also have students. I think most of this group is under 30. And yeah, so I just wanted to share that with you because you're Open Source Community Africa. I think that's my last slide. Next. Oh, I guess I have some next steps. Yeah, I'll go over the next steps and then we can go to questions. So basically we're now, Sustain Africa is not correct. I am not at Sustain Africa. I'm here with you in a webinar, but you can see we are basically doing a roadshow of presenting the definition around the world. So this month I was in New York, and now I'm doing this event with you. Next month I'll be in Hong Kong, then Buenos Aires, and then we're going to be presenting the final definition in October in the US, and also having a data workshop in Paris, where we'll be releasing the stable version. Next. And if you want to be involved in the process, the best way to do that is to join the forum, the public discussion forum, and you do need to create an account, which means becoming an OSCI member, but you can do that for free if you want. You don't have to pay the membership fee. And basically any news we share on the forum, and also discussions and debates about the definition happen on the forum. And we also have bi-weekly virtual town halls that rotate between, I guess, an Eastern Hemisphere and Western Hemisphere schedule. It's a big planet, but we try to be accessible to different parts of it. And those forums are also, or the town halls are also announced on the forum. Next. That's it. Okay. So yeah, I am ready for your questions. Thank you. Hi, Ruth. Yes, I met Ruth last week in New York at the United Nations, where Ruth presented, which was very cool. Hi, Hijabi Coder. Hi, Success. So how do you want to do this, Balaji?
I've been talking since I didn't realize I was muted. Yeah, I was saying it's really interesting seeing how these processes work and seeing a lot of work that goes into co-designing the standards. And I was trying to ask how often does the OSI, co-design many of the standards?
I'm not sure that they have used this particular process before, but they came to me. So they said, hey, we know we need to engage our stakeholders in a better way. We need some help to do the lifting and the design and the implementation on that. So they're the ones that said, hey, we want to work in this way. That's more consultative. So yeah.
Yeah, that's really, I mean, that's really good, because I saw, when you talked about the different inclusive process that went into it, especially when you mentioned the fact that when you try to create a global standard, you definitely want to involve everyone around the world in that sense. So I think this makes so much sense. And just as Mer said, if you're interested in participating in the process, the link is still on the screen. As always, we'll also share that with you on the Discord server, so you could catch up and, see how the process has worked and everything around that. So if you do have any questions, the comment sections are open. Feel free to keep asking now. I'm just going to ask a couple to Mer that some already asked before now. So, okay. So the first one says, for truly open source AI, don't we need open training data, open source AI algorithms, and open source AI hardware?
Okay, so I'm hearing training data, I'm hearing algorithms, and I'm hearing hardware, those three components.
Yeah.
Okay. So I think the data set, training data set question is, that is the question of which there is the greatest difference of opinion. The way the definition has landed now is that we want to make inclusion in the set open source AI to be a little bit more permissive, so we can have some systems that fall into that set. And so we can say, hey, this is where we want people to be. This is more open. It is my understanding that if data sets are required, that there might be an empty set. So it might be that there are no AI systems that would meet the criteria, and that for some people, it is okay to have a definition that does not include any systems, because it is kind of setting a bar at a certain place. But the way the board decided was that they wanted a definition for which current systems could meet the standard to encourage developers to create in an open way. For algorithm, my understanding would be that would be covered by code. So I think open code is non-controversial, and that we do want that to be shared. Hardware is an interesting question. So there were people that brought up the idea of requiring code, particularly like, hardware. So like computing power is a big source of inequity in AI. And basically we looked to the standard of open source software, and we decided that while we agree with that it is outside of the scope of the open source definition itself. So for example, there are also issues of ethics and responsibilities in OSCA, and we support those goals, and those are outside of the scope of the definition itself, which is just about freedom to study, use, modify, share. And the way that that is being done is by people or organizations like Digital Public Goods Alliance, that they are building these standards of responsibility and ethics on top of the open source AI definition. So they're saying, first of all, you must be open, you must allow study, use, modification, and sharing, you must have these preferred forms, and then we also require that you do these take these different actions to ensure that your system is responsible and ethical. So that's a little bit extra than what you asked, but also important.
All right, thank you very much. I think another question which is slightly related to this, so I just try and summarize it. It's more so, what would you describe as the ideal model for open source AI? Should parts of it stay closed source, or it's open source AI itself like a gimmick? In a sense, it's more so, yeah, I think it already hinges more on what you talked about around the 4 freedoms. So if you want to touch a bit more on that in that sense.
So I guess my ideal open source AI system is as open as possible. So it's I guess I was going to say that everything created is open. I guess the only caveat I would give to that is I do not want personal data or personally identifiable information to be shared. So I guess for me, even though I say everything that is part of the system should be open, I think I do even have that caveat. So I think that would be my answer. And the fact that data set is not required also allows for the protection of personally identifiable information. So we are not requiring people to share something that could, say, be a security or privacy threat to an individual, particularly if that individual might not know or have consented to have their data be part of a training data set. So that is my answer.
All right, as open as much as possible. We have another question from the comments. So Ruth is asking, how will OSI help with helping companies creating OSS models to align with the standard?
Yeah,
so
I think, so this is more a question for OSI than for me. My understanding, though, is that our responsibility is to make the definition as clear as possible, so that someone who is trying to meet the criteria understands what's being required. Because OSI is a fairly small organization in terms of the actual people that are working at the organization, I don't think that they would work one-on-one with organizations, but we just need to make sure that definition is very clear. And that's why we're doing these validations, to make sure that it's clear what is required to meet the criteria.
All right. So thank you very much. If you do have any more questions, feel free to share them in the chat. I think that's most of the questions directly related to the open source AI definition. And I do think now that we have this conversation continues, and in all the other smaller cycles, they could still continue talking about this and share feedback. The link and the QR code is still on the screen. If you want to join and follow through with the discussion, please feel free. So we do have, I think Ariel tried to add to what you just said. We will also provide proper documentation and supporting materials. And I think this is also where communities like ours shine in that sense. So helping to distribute this documentation and resources to help people better understand the standard. And I think that's why we're glad you're here today, because now we understand more about what that open source AI standard would look like. So I see another question here from James. It says, but will these reviews and checks happen over time, or are they like a one-time type of deal? We have seen some orgs being very open in the onset, but going a tiny but rogue after getting some positive PR. It's a very good question.
Interesting. So I guess if I understand your question correctly, I guess the way I would respond to it is this by versions. So there might be a version of an AI system that is licensed as open, and then the developers might then decide to do a closed version, which they can do. But yeah, so I think that's how it would happen. And certainly meeting the criteria of the open source AI definition is an ongoing criteria, just as making open source software is. The open source definition for software has been in place for, I should know this exactly, maybe Ariel can correct me, I think it's about 20 years. So you can license a piece of software as open at any time. So that's just an open door. But yes, definitely creators could create an open version and then they decide to go private and the next version is not open, and that's their freedom to do that.
Yeah, so would that mean also that, so because I think the question, yeah, would that be, because for example, if someone, open sources their, AI system and it's called open source, and probably in a further version, it no longer meets the standard, but they still maintain calling it that name, who checks those kind of things in that scenario? Or is it left to the community to, flag stuff like that?
Yeah, so I guess, so that would imply that there is a version. Okay, I'll just, before I respond, I'll read James's. This is the same.
No, it's the same question. Yeah. It's the same
one. I see the same question. Okay. So from what I'm understanding, you're saying that that's something, well, okay, I guess I'll respond in another way. So there's this idea of certification. How do you certify that an AI system is open, and who does that?
Yeah.
So the current method for the open source definition for software is that it's self-applied. So, and it's legally binding. So you create, as a developer, you create a piece of software, you license it as open, and then legally, that's the copyright. The copyright is open licensed, right? So there are complexities to applying that to AI systems because it's not only code, it's also model, and it's also data, which has different copyright, interacts with copyright law differently. But that is, I think, the model that we would be working from in terms of this idea of certification. I think that's actually a legal question. So for example, if something was licensed and legally defined as open, and then I guess maybe materials were removed. But I mean, removing something from the internet, that is not extremely effective as actually removing it from use, right? So I think, so I don't know if that helps to answer your question, but I'm sure there's examples from open source software that if I'm new to this space, so that someone could say, hey, this is what happened in the past with software when someone tried that, and and then we can think, how does that apply to open source AI systems? But that's the best answer.
Yeah, so I'll let the person confirm, but I think this adds more clarity. Knowing the fact that it's a legal thing then means it's kind of binding, so I think that makes sense. So we have another question from Hijabi Code that says the requirement seems to auto-disqualify most of the models, especially those requiring people's consents ethically to train the models. I'm not sure what the question is, but I'm guessing it's some sentiment of, well, is the requirements okay then if it's disqualifying most of the model?
So this idea of ethics is something we support, but it is something that we expect to be built on top of the OSCA ID. So I guess what in the definition are you seeing that would constrain those models from use?
Okay, so that's a follow question. If you want to respond to Jabi, please feel free to like type it out, and then I would ask Mara again. But while we wait for that, I'm just going to ask you some unrelated open AI question. And the first one is just pretty much, it's career based. How did you decide to start your consulting co-design firm? You really find, well, in this part of the world, I mean, for me, this is the first time I'm hearing, something like this and seeing how it also works, for OSI to work with you and figuring all of the standards out. So how did you get here?
Yeah, so I have been self-employed and have been a consultant for most of my career. My professional career, I've just been self-employed. So I started off as a digital activism consultant, which I got to do that because I was doing volunteer work around study of digital activism. So I guess while I was even a student, and I had an organization called DigiActive, and I published a guide with some other volunteers around, and this will show how old I am. It was Twitter for activism and Facebook for activism, which no one would write those guides now. One of the platforms doesn't even have the same name. But basically, I was able to show my expertise by doing things and publishing things for free. And so then people hired me as a consultant to train other people on those principles. And I did that for a while. And then I decided at some point that I didn't just want to be working solo. I wanted to have a team around me and create a work culture that was just a really nice day-to-day work culture. And so I decided to start a company. Basically, I guess that happened maybe around 2018. I incorporated my company earlier, but I was just working for myself. And then, the pandemic really affected my company deeply. We pivoted from one kind of work into another kind of work. So, I would say just establishing your expertise by doing things on your own time and making sure you're publishing that so people know you have expertise, and then you can start getting paid for doing what you're good at and build from there.
All right, that's very interesting. I think that the next one is a very interesting question. It's you've been in many places, you've lived in many places, including Ghana. So
yes,
what's the experience like living in Africa during the time you were there?
It was really spectacular. The US is a part of the African diaspora, a really important part of the African diaspora, obviously through tragic mechanisms, but we have a spectacular culture of people whose lineage is from Africa here in the US. So I had been exposed to African culture here. I had studied African American history when I was in school, particularly our civil rights movement, particularly the arts movement of the Harlem Renaissance. And that just really made me very excited about Black culture because it's part of the culture of the country I grew up in. And so when I was in college, I decided to spend my junior semester abroad in Africa. And I went to Ghana because I spoke English. So I needed a country where I could speak English. And it was spectacular. It was transformative. I think part of the reason why I now have this of course, something needs to be a global decision-making process of a global definition. I mean, part of what makes that seem so obvious to me is by living around the world and feeling connected to the world. And there's a UNDP project to build out language models for indigenous languages that I learned about last week. And the language they're starting with is Tree, which is a Ghanaian language, which I actually studied Tree while I was in Ghana. So that was just really cool, from that later time in my life. But it was, really, really big, important experience for me.
That's really interesting. So what was your favorite part of being in Ghana?
Oh gosh. What was my
Fully on.
favorite part of being in Ghana? I'm just, yeah. I guess, the people, right? I'm sure that there was a lot that I didn't understand being an American there. I'm sure I was really awkward, but people were really kind and understanding with me. And I guess one thing I remember is I took a dance class, and the way we dance in the U.S. is we most often are dancing with like two people or with just like one person. But the African dance, it was dancing in a circle, and it was like dancing in a community. And that was just something that it just was very different for me, because like in the US, we have this very individualized culture, right? And so this idea of, moving around in a circle, and that the dance is something that the community is doing, not just one or two people. I guess that's another thing where it's like, there's this different way of, of having culture that was just lovely, that I appreciated.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Thank you so much, Mer, for sharing all that.
Yeah.
I think Jabi just added a bit more context to the earlier question. So this is the first question, which was around some requirements seems to auto disqualify most of the models. And the follow-up is, in my understanding, most of the models or the original ones were not exactly transparent with their training data. So the requirements regarding user consent got my attention.
Got it. So we do not have a requirement on user consent. Maybe that's something that you disagree with, but we actually don't have a requirement on user consent. That is a layer that could be built on top of the open source definition. However, you're right that we do have a requirement on transparency of description of the training data and how you got it. So as long as the creator is willing to describe how they got their training data, the provenance, the labeling procedure, all those things on that previous slide, then they could meet the criteria. And then it would be up to another set of guidance on top of the OSCA, to further require consent. But yeah, consent itself is not part of the open source AI definition.
All right. Thank you very much, Mer. So if you do have any more questions, you can just put them in the Discord and we can pass that across and get that answered eventually later on. So thank you so much once again, Mer, for joining us and sharing this. And I hope this has been insightful for our audience. So
yeah, it's been a pleasure. Thank you so much. Thanks, everyone. Thanks for the questions. Take care.
All right. So see you next time, everyone, and do have a blissful rest of your day.